They thought my tiny firm was embarrassing. They had no idea I owned the entire company that controls their future. My name is Sarah, and for the past 5 years, I've watched my younger brother Michael climb the corporate ladder at Henderson & Associates, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in Chicago. What he doesn't know, what nobody in my family knows, is that I'm not just an employee at a tiny firm. I'm the sole owner of Henderson & Associates' parent company, Meridian Holdings. Growing up, Michael was always the golden child, straight A's, varsity football, MBA from Northwestern. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one who worked 2 jobs to pay for community college, then clawed my way through night school to finish my business degree. While Michael was networking at fraternity parties, I was learning the fundamentals of corporate acquisition from the ground up, starting as a junior analyst at a small investment firm that nobody in my family took seriously. The pattern started early. Family dinners where Mom would beam about Michael's latest promotion while barely acknowledging my steady progress. Holiday gatherings where relatives would ask Michael about his important work and then turn to me with pity. "Still at that little company, sweetie?" The condescending smiles. The assumption that because I wasn't flashy about my success, I wasn't successful at all. Michael made it worse. He'd introduce me to his friends as his struggling sister, who just doesn't have the business gene. At last year's Christmas party, he actually said, in front of his entire social circle, "Sarah's doing her best, but some people are just meant for smaller things." The laughter that followed still echoes in my mind. What they didn't see were the late nights I spent building my investment portfolio, the careful acquisitions, the strategic partnerships. 3 years ago, when Meridian Holdings quietly purchased Henderson & Associates through a series of shell companies, I made sure my name never appeared on any public documents. Michael continued his work, blissfully unaware that his monthly paychecks were ultimately signed by the sister he loved to embarrass. Michael met Rebecca at one of Henderson's client events. She came from old Chicago money, the kind of family that owns half of Lincoln Park and treats charity galas like casual dinner parties. Rebecca was beautiful, connected, and everything our middle-class family aspired to be. She was also exactly the kind of person who would find Michael's condescending attitude toward me charming rather than cruel. The engagement announcement came with all the fanfare Michael loved: a Facebook post with professional photos, a story in the society pages, Mom practically hyperventilated with pride, calling everyone she knew to talk about her son marrying into the Wellington family. Rebecca's parents owned a vineyard in Napa, a penthouse downtown, and a cottage in the Hamptons that was bigger than most people's primary homes. Michael's personality shifted after the engagement. The casual dismissiveness toward me became sharper, more calculated. At family gatherings, he'd make sure Rebecca understood that I was the family disappointment. "Sarah works for this tiny consulting firm," he'd explain, using air quotes around consulting firm like it was some elaborate joke. "Nothing like Henderson & Associates, obviously, but we all can't be high achievers." Rebecca would smile politely, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. To her, I represented everything their social circle looked down on: small ambitions, limited success, the kind of person who just didn't matter in their world. She never bothered to ask what my firm actually did or showed any interest in my work. In her mind, I was already categorized and dismissed. The wedding planning became a 6-month display of everything Michael thought separated him from me. The venue was the Palmer House, with a guest list that read like a who's who of Chicago business elite. The rehearsal dinner alone cost more than most people's entire weddings. Michael made sure everyone knew these details, especially me. 2 weeks before the wedding, Michael cornered me at Mom's house during a family dinner. "I hope you understand that Rebecca's family is very particular about appearances," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It would probably be better if you didn't mention your work too much at the reception. You know how awkward it gets when people don't have much in common." That was Michael's way of telling me to be invisible at his wedding, to sit quietly in my off-the-rack dress and not embarrass him in front of his new family. I nodded and smiled, just like I always did. Inside, I was already planning exactly how visible I intended to be. The wedding day arrived with all the pageantry Michael had orchestrated. The Palmer House ballroom was decorated with enough flowers to supply a small funeral home. and the guest list included 3 city aldermen, a federal judge, and half the partners from the most prestigious firms in Chicago. I recognized several of them as clients of companies in my portfolio, though they had no idea who I was. I wore a simple navy dress and took my assigned seat at table 12, far enough from the head table to be forgotten, close enough to the kitchen to catch the chaos of the catering staff. Mom had tried to advocate for a better placement, but Michael explained that seating was complex with Rebecca's family's requirements. During the cocktail hour, I watched Michael work the room like the political climber he'd always been. He'd mastered the art of the firm handshake, the confident laugh, the way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the conversation. Rebecca glided beside him in a dress that cost more than my car, accepting congratulations with the grace of someone born to this kind of attention. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that unlimited money can make anything beautiful. Rebecca looked stunning, Michael looked proud, and their families looked appropriately emotional. I sat in the third row on the groom's side, watching my parents beam with pride at their successful son's perfect wedding to his perfect bride. But it was during the reception that Michael really showed his true colors. The speeches had been going for 20 minutes when Michael took the microphone for his own remarks. He thanked Rebecca's family for welcoming him, praised his groomsmen for their friendship, and acknowledged our parents for their sacrifices. Then his eyes found me in the crowd. "I also want to acknowledge my sister Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending affection. "Poor sis, still working at that tiny firm, but she's here tonight and that's what matters." The laughter was immediate and uncomfortable. We can't all be blessed with the opportunities that bring us to places like Henderson and Associates, but Sarah's doing her best with what she has. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. 400 people, including some of the most powerful business leaders in Chicago, laughing at the idea of my tiny firm and my limited opportunities. Rebecca's father actually chuckled and shook his head, as if Michael's struggling sister was exactly the kind of family embarrassment he'd expected. I felt the familiar heat of shame creeping up my neck, the same feeling I'd had at countless family gatherings. But this time was different. This time, Michael had miscalculated. Badly. I was still processing the public humiliation when I noticed a commotion near the bar. James Wilson, CEO of Henderson and Associates and one of the most respected executives in Chicago, was making his way through the crowd. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that made conversations stop when he entered a room. Michael had pointed him out earlier with barely contained excitement. "That's my boss's boss's boss," he'd whispered to Rebecca's cousins. "Having him here is huge for my career." James Wilson represented everything Michael aspired to: power, respect, and the kind of success that opened doors throughout the city. I watched as James approached our table, his expression polite but focused. The conversations around me faded as people noticed his movement through the crowd. Michael, still holding court near the head table, hadn't seen him yet. "Ma'am," James said, stopping directly in front of my chair. His voice was formal but warm, with the kind of authority that came from running a company worth hundreds of millions. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person at my table turned to stare, their expressions ranging from confusion to shock. This was James Wilson, the CEO of Henderson and Associates, speaking to me like he knew me, like I mattered. "Why wouldn't I be?" I replied, standing to meet his gaze. My voice was steady, calm, completely at odds with the chaos I could feel building around us. James smiled then, the kind of smile that held secrets. "Of course. I should have realized. Family connections and all." By now, Michael had noticed the attention focused on our corner of the ballroom. I could see him pushing through the crowd, his face a mixture of confusion and growing panic. Rebecca was right behind him, her perfect composure beginning to crack. "Sarah?" Michael's voice cracked slightly as he reached us. "What? How do you know Mr. Wilson?" James turned to Michael with the polite but distant expression he reserved for lower-level employees. "Michael, isn't it? From the consulting division." Michael nodded eagerly, probably hoping this was some kind of networking opportunity. "I work for your sister." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Michael's face went white. Rebecca's mouth actually fell open. The guests at nearby tables had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that something significant was happening. "I'm sorry," Michael stammered. "I think there's been some confusion. Sarah works for a small firm. She's not... she doesn't..." I smiled then, the same smile I'd been practicing in boardrooms for the past 5 years. The smile that had closed million-dollar deals and intimidated competitors twice my size. "Actually, Michael," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "I own the company." The explosion was immediate and total. Michael's legs actually gave out slightly, forcing him to grab the back of a chair for support. Rebecca's face cycled through confusion, shock, and what looked like fear. The guests who had been listening began murmuring urgently to each other, the news spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "That's impossible," Michael whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You work for that tiny consulting firm. Mom and Dad said..." "You never said?" "Henderson and Associates is owned by Meridian Holdings," I explained calmly, as if I were giving a presentation to investors. "I am the sole owner and founder of Meridian Holdings. James here runs day-to-day operations at Henderson, but all major decisions go through me, including personnel decisions." The color drained from Michael's face as the implications hit him. For the past 3 years, he'd been working for me. Every promotion, every raise, every opportunity he'd bragged about had ultimately come from the sister he'd spent years humiliating. James cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested, but I shook my head. "No need for privacy," I said, looking directly at Michael. "After all, family business should be transparent, don't you think?" Rebecca had found her voice, though it was shaky. But you said you worked for some small company. You let us think." "I never lied," I replied evenly. "Meridian Holdings is small. It's just me and a handful of advisors. We prefer to keep our portfolio companies independent. It's more efficient that way." The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of Chicago's golden boy discovering that his dismissed sister was actually his ultimate boss. I could see our parents pushing through the guests, their faces reflecting confusion and dawning realization. Michael was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "How long?" he asked quietly. 3 years, I answered. "I acquired Henderson about 6 months after you started there. Your performance reviews cross my desk quarterly, Michael. You're adequate." The word adequate hit him like a slap. For someone who'd built his entire identity around being exceptional, being dismissed as merely adequate by the sister he'd been mocking was devastating. "Why didn't you tell us?" Mom's voice came from behind the crowd, trembling with emotions I couldn't quite identify. I turned to face my parents, these people who had shaped so much of my drive to succeed through their casual dismissal of my ambitions. When exactly should I have mentioned it? During one of those dinners where you talked about Michael's achievements while ignoring mine? Or maybe at Christmas when Uncle Bob asked if I was still playing office at my little company? Dad's face was red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "You made us look like fools." "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped correcting your assumptions." The aftermath of my revelation spread through the Palmer House ballroom like spilled wine on white silk, impossible to contain and permanently staining everything it touched. Rebecca's family huddled in urgent whispered conversations, their expressions cycling between shock and what I could only describe as recalculation. The Wellingtons were nothing if not pragmatic, and I watched in real time as they processed that their new son-in-law's embarrassing sister was actually a significant power player in Chicago's business landscape. Michael stood frozen in the center of it all, still gripping that chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The confident, condescending man who had publicly mocked me 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified. And he should have been terrified because for the first time in his life, Michael was facing the consequences of treating people as disposable. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk, privately." I glanced around the ballroom, taking in the sea of faces staring at us with varying degrees of fascination and horror. Actually, Michael, I think we've done enough talking publicly for one evening. Monday morning, you can schedule an appointment with my assistant like any other employee who needs to discuss their career trajectory. The formality of my words hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca reached for his arm, but he was too stunned to respond to her touch. James Wilson, ever the diplomatic professional, stepped forward. Perhaps I should handle communications between corporate and the consulting division going forward, he suggested carefully, to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. That would be best, I agreed, then turned to address the crowd that had gathered around us. I apologize for the disruption to such a beautiful celebration. Please continue enjoying the evening. It was a dismissal, polite but absolute. The guests began to disperse slowly, but I could feel their eyes on me as they moved back to their tables. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, urgent, speculative, charged with the energy that comes from witnessing a social earthquake. Mom appeared at my elbow, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. Sarah, honey, we had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us about your success? The question hung between us, loaded with years of assumptions and missed opportunities for understanding. I looked at this woman who had raised me, who had somehow managed to be proud of one child's achievements while remaining blind to the others. Because you never asked, Mom. For 5 years, every time I tried to share something about my work, you'd change the subject to Michael's latest promotion. You taught me that my accomplishments weren't worth discussing. Dad joined us, his mayor's smile nowhere to be seen. In its place was the expression of a man realizing he'd fundamentally misunderstood his own daughter. But Sarah, if we'd known. If you'd known what? You would have loved me differently? Been proud of me then instead of now? I shook my head, feeling suddenly exhausted. That's exactly the problem, Dad. Your pride in me shouldn't be dependent on my net worth. The weekend passed in a blur of urgent phone calls and family meetings that I politely declined to attend. Rebecca's parents, according to Mom's increasingly frantic voicemails, were concerned about the family dynamics they'd just married into. Michael had apparently locked himself in his new condo and wasn't returning calls. The society pages were already sniffing around the story, sensing scandal in Chicago's business elite. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that October in Chicago sometimes provides. I walked into my office at Meridian Holdings, a modest space in a converted warehouse that deliberately projected none of the corporate grandeur my wealth could afford. My assistant, Patricia, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd followed me from my first investment job, was waiting with coffee and a knowing smile. I assume you've seen the Tribune business section, she said, sliding the newspaper across my desk. The headline read, Wedding Shock, Mystery Mogul Revealed at Palmer House Reception. Subtle, I muttered, scanning the article. The reporter had done their homework, tracing Meridian Holdings' acquisitions and painting a picture of a reclusive business prodigy who had built an empire while flying completely under the radar. My photo, a professional headshot from 3 years ago that I'd forgotten existed, stared back at me from the business page. Also, Patricia continued, James Wilson called. Michael Rodriguez is requesting an urgent meeting with senior management. Apparently, he's quite insistent. I checked my watch. 9:15 a.m. Michael had lasted exactly 45 minutes into the work week before cracking. Schedule him for this afternoon. And Patricia, make sure James is present. This needs to be handled by the book. The meeting took place in Henderson and Associates' main conference room, a space designed to impress clients with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. I arrived 15 minutes early, a power move I'd learned in my first year of business school. When you own the company, you set the tone for every interaction. Michael entered the room looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, wrinkled shirt, day-old stubble, the hollow-eyed look of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered. James followed, carrying a thick personnel file that I recognized as Michael's employment record. Sarah, Michael began, his voice hoarse, I need to understand what happens now. With my job, with my career, with everything. I gestured for them to sit, maintaining the professional demeanor I'd cultivated through years of difficult negotiations. That depends entirely on you, Michael. From a business perspective, nothing has changed. You're a competent consultant with a solid track record. Your employment isn't in jeopardy because of our family relationship." Relief flooded his face, but I wasn't finished. "However," I continued, "your recent behavior raises some concerns about your judgment and professionalism. Publicly disparaging colleagues, making assumptions about other firms' capabilities, demonstrating bias in your professional assessments. These are all performance issues that need to be addressed." Michael's face reddened. "You're talking about Saturday night, about the wedding." "I'm talking about a pattern of behavior that extends far beyond Saturday night," I corrected. "James, would you mind sharing Michael's last performance review?" James opened the file with the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult corporate situations. "Michael, your last review noted tendency toward dismissive communication with support staff and occasional lapses in professional courtesy with colleagues from smaller firms. There were also client complaints about your condescending attitude during joint projects." The blood drained from Michael's face as he realized the scope of what was being documented. I didn't know those complaints had been filed formally." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You didn't know because you assumed your behavior didn't matter. You treated people poorly because you thought there would be no consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at the conference table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "What do you want from me? An apology? I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry for everything I said, for how I treated you, for not recognizing your success. Just tell me what you want me to do." It was the apology I'd waited years to hear, but it felt hollow now, coerced by professional fear rather than genuine remorse. I leaned back in my chair, considering my response carefully. "I want you to do your job, Michael. I want you to treat your colleagues with respect. I want you to remember that success isn't measured by how many people you can look down on, but by how much value you can create for your clients and your team. And if I do that, if I change how I operate, then you'll have a future at Henderson and Associates. If you don't, you'll find yourself looking for new employment regardless of our family connection." The meeting ended with Michael looking smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of his situation. James escorted him out, leaving me alone in the conference room with a view of the city I'd quietly conquered while my family assumed I was failing. The next few weeks passed in a strange rhythm of professional normalcy punctuated by family drama. Michael threw himself into his work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove their worth. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. The condescending comments stopped, the eye-rolling during meetings disappeared, and he began actually listening when junior staff offered suggestions. Rebecca called me twice, both conversations awkward attempts to rebuild a relationship that had never really existed. She was clearly struggling with the revelation that the family disappointment she'd dismissed was actually more successful than anyone in her social circle. The cognitive dissonance was almost palpable in her voice. "I just want you to know," she said during our second conversation, "that I never meant to be dismissive of your work. I simply didn't understand the scope of what you were doing." It was a politician's apology, technically correct but emotionally meaningless. "I appreciate that, Rebecca. I hope you and Michael can find a way to move forward." "About that," she said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone approaching a sensitive topic. "Michael is struggling with all of this. The adjustment has been difficult." What she meant, I realized, was that Michael's confidence had been shattered and his newfound humility was affecting their marriage. The golden boy Rebecca had fallen for was gone, replaced by someone who questioned his own judgment and worried constantly about his professional standing. The most difficult conversation came 6 weeks after the wedding, when Mom showed up at my office unannounced. Patricia tried to intercept her, but Mom deployed the full force of maternal authority to push past my defenses. "We need to talk," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk like she owned it. "This family is falling apart, and you're the only one who can fix it." I looked at this woman who had shaped so much of my drive to succeed through her casual neglect of my achievements. "I'm not responsible for fixing anything, Mom." I'm responsible for running my business and living my life. Your brother is miserable, she continued as if I hadn't spoken. Rebecca's threatening to leave him. Your father hasn't slept properly in weeks because he feels so guilty about how we treated you. This whole family is in crisis because you decided to humiliate Michael at his wedding. The accusation hit me like a slap. I humiliated Michael by existing, by being successful, by not hiding my achievements to make him feel better about himself, by ambushing him publicly instead of telling your family the truth years ago. I stood up, the anger I'd been suppressing for weeks finally finding its voice. I tried to tell you, Mom. For years, I tried to share my successes with this family. Every time I mentioned a business achievement, you'd change the subject. Every time I tried to explain what I was building, you'd dismiss it as unimportant. You taught me that my accomplishments didn't matter to you. Mom's face crumpled slightly, but she pressed on. We're your family, Sarah. Family means forgiveness. It means second chances. Family also means respect, I replied. It means celebrating each other's successes instead of diminishing them. It means not publicly mocking your daughter's career because it doesn't fit your definition of success. The months that followed brought a gradual shift in family dynamics that felt both seismic and subtle. Michael's work performance improved dramatically as he learned to channel his competitive drive into collaborative leadership rather than condescending superiority. His quarterly reviews reflected the change. Clients praised his newfound humility. Colleagues appreciated his willingness to listen, and his project outcomes improved significantly. The professional growth seemed to stabilize his marriage as well. Rebecca, perhaps recognizing that the confident man she'd married had been built on a foundation of arrogance rather than genuine competence, began to appreciate the more grounded version of her husband. Their interactions, when I occasionally observed them at family gatherings, seemed more genuine and less performative. My parents struggled more with the adjustment. Dad, in particular, seemed haunted by the realization that he'd fundamentally misunderstood his own daughter. He began making awkward attempts to show interest in my business, asking questions that revealed how little he understood about what I did. The efforts were touching, if late. Mom's approach was more direct. She launched a campaign to rebuild our relationship that involved frequent visits, elaborate home-cooked meals, and the kind of maternal attention I'd craved as a child, but no longer needed as an adult. It was simultaneously heartwarming and exhausting. The real change came during Thanksgiving dinner, 8 months after the wedding. The entire family was gathered at Mom and Dad's house, the same dining room where I'd endured years of casual dismissal. But this time, the dynamic was different. Sarah, Dad said, raising his wine glass, I want to propose a toast to my daughter, who built something extraordinary while we were too blind to see it. It was a public acknowledgement I'd never thought I'd hear, but it felt different than I'd imagined. Less validating, more melancholy. The recognition was welcome, but it came tainted with the knowledge that it was only possible because of my financial success. Michael, who had been quiet through most of the dinner, suddenly spoke up. I want to say something too. He stood, his wine glass trembling slightly in his hand. I spent years thinking I was better than Sarah because I had a prestigious job and she worked for a small company. I was wrong about everything, not just about her business, but about what makes someone successful. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. Sarah didn't just build a company. She built herself into the kind of person who could build a company. She worked harder than any of us realized, sacrificed more than we acknowledged, and succeeded in spite of our lack of support, not because of it. The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. I looked around the table at these people who had shaped me through their dismissal and driven me to succeed through their doubt. Thank you, I said simply, because anything more would have opened wounds I wasn't ready to expose. The evening ended with the kind of careful politeness that characterizes relationships in transition. We were family, but we were also strangers learning to see each other clearly for the first time. Michael and I were siblings, but we were also boss and employee navigating the complex intersection of personal and professional relationships. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I had everything I'd worked for: financial success, professional respect, and finally, family acknowledgement. But the victory felt more complex than I'd anticipated. I hadn't set out to humiliate Michael or prove my parents wrong. I'd simply wanted to build something meaningful and be recognized for the work I was doing. The fact that this recognition had come through shock rather than gradual awareness said more about my family's limitations than my own achievements. The real success, I realized, wasn't in the moment Michael's face went white at his wedding reception. It was in the months that followed, watching him grow into someone worthy of the respect he'd always demanded. It was in seeing my parents grapple with their assumptions and try, however imperfectly, to bridge the gap their blindness had created. Most importantly, it was in learning that my worth wasn't dependent on their recognition. I had built my empire not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. The validation I'd received that night at the Palmer house was satisfying, but it was also unnecessary. I had already won the only battle that truly mattered, the one against my own self-doubt. 6 months later, Michael was promoted to senior consultant, a position he earned through merit rather than politics. Rebecca had begun asking genuine questions about my business, showing an interest that seemed motivated by curiosity rather than social calculation. My parents still struggled sometimes, but they were trying. And me? I was exactly where I'd always planned to be, running my company, making strategic decisions, and building something lasting. The only difference was that now my family finally understood what I'd been doing all along. The tiny firm, as it turned out, was anything but tiny. It was just selective about who deserved to know its true scope.